Hello, my name's Osha, and I talk about American presidents, and but I've been doing these videos in honor of Black History Month, and I want to try and wrap it up by emphasizing the significance of Black Americans like Morgan Freeman in becoming great cultural ambassadors for America. When I went to live in school in Italy, in Milan, and of course, Milan is a great cultural hub. Of course, Italians have their own great history as well, going back 3,000 years to the time of the Romans. But significantly, it was emphasized that Black Americans, right, we represented American culture, right? So Black American culture has defined what American culture is today, whether it's in the music, whether it's in Hollywood, whether it's in the fashion, right? So that it can't be that can't be understated, right? So it can't be exaggerated. It can't be, everybody identifies American culture with black people, whether it's in sports, where blacks are, they're dominant and all that. But that, the notion of continually finding the significance or worth of black people in what they can do for America, again, still has that tendency of stripping them of their humanity, right? Their humanity, and it doesn't address the injustices that blacks continue to face in America, right? It doesn't address the reality that they've gone through the trauma of 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, and continuous extant racism as well. Um, and so in rebuttal to Morgan Freeman's there's no racism in America, if that was what he was implying. I go back to what even the most eminent Black American professors have experienced. I remember I once had the privilege of being able to sit in some classes taught by Harvard professors. I would go when I lived in Cambridge. I'd go and attend some of their lectures. And one of the professors I met who also gave me an autographed copy of his book Sellout, right? A critical race theory book. That's Professor Randall Kennedy, eminent scholar. Of course, I'm going to give his credentials. Princeton undergrad, went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and he got his law degrees, JD, from Yale Law School, and he's been a distinguished professor at Harvard Law School ever since. Um, his late wife was a physician, I think. Um, and I remember he in a class he had, race relations class he had, which I was fortunate to be able to sit in on, right? He advised his students, majority of the students in there were Black Americans, right? And I mean, they were, in fact, it was diverse, all sorts of people. But in this instance, he was addressing his Black students that um, something he does that when they graduate, they're going to go and become distinguished people because these were people at Harvard. And you graduate from Harvard Law School, basically, you write your ticket, right? Your status is changing. And he understood that there were some Black American students there who might have come from less privileged backgrounds, but he was letting them know that their status is going to change. And he gave them the advice based on what he did, right? When he said every time he moved into a new neighborhood, the first thing he would do was to go and introduce himself to the local police station, the police department, so that they know him, they recognize him, that there's a black man in the neighborhood, so they don't embarrass him, right? They don't embarrass him in front of his neighbors. Now, this was somebody who was a professor, a lawyer, but he understood his rights, but at the same time, he understood that as a black man, he couldn't enjoy the presumption of innocence, of the equality, equal rights, and freedom from discrimination, racial profiling that white majority is free from, regardless of their socioeconomic status, right? So this was upper class black man right? But he's letting these black students graduating from Harvard Law School that look, you're going to experience you're not yet free from discrimination from the police department. And as a as a justification of his fears, his concerns, while I was still in Harvard, I remember it was in 2009, everybody knew when Professor Henry Louis Gates, also a Harvard professor, but in history, everybody knows the distinguished professor at Harvard, Professor Henry Louis Gates. He does uh, the ancestry programs, finding your roots. He was arrested in 2009 at his own home without probable cause, without doing anything, by a Sergeant James Crowley who just wanted to humiliate him, intimidate him, right? And you can research that story of what happened, right? Okay, he traveled and he left his key, but he normally used would leave his window open so he could just go in if he forgot his key and slide through. And so a neighbor called the cops. The neighbor should have known it was him because he said this is something he's done regularly. He lived alone, and so when the cops showed up, they saw it was him. He identified himself. It was his home. He lived there. It was his home. But the police was, I guess, glib with him or offensive, and Professor Gates pointed out that, hey, why is he treating him in a certain way? Is it because he's black? And we've had these experiences on May 16, 2023, when the police came to raid me. They had first come on May 14 because I called the police. I'd been assaulted by a Howard University professor, Jide Iwariri, and my neighbor. They had attempted to kidnap me and assaulted me at my home. And so I called the police. But the female police officer who came started to talk to me in a curt, dismissive, rude manner. And so this is and she was white. This is the manner of white cops with blacks, right? So that's it. Professor Henry Louis Gates ended up being arrested. He was a 58-year-old man, diminutive, walked with a cane. He's a tiny man, about 5'2", 5'3", 5'4", tiny man. And there are these huge, burly cops handcuffing him, humiliating him in his neighborhood, right? And so these are experiences that show that you can't dismiss race in America, right? Apart from, I talked about, blacks representing being ambassadors of American culture. They dictate, they direct, they project what turns out to become American culture. They dictate it. Now there's a new culture that they're dictating, that they're creating, that that appears negative, and that's jail culture, right? The culture of jail, right? There was a gangster rap thing. I remember when I was in Nigeria, I was into rap. I liked NWA. I loved Snoop Dogg. I loved so that was when I was a kid in Nigeria, and I didn't understand America. I didn't understand what was going on in America. That these guys were actually depicting real life, right? But now I'm an American. I live in America. I've lived in America most of my life, and I've been wrongfully arrested. And I'm seeing kids in jail, right, who are glorifying this violence ignorantly, and they want to go out and it's in jail. I learned some people even initially do bad stuff just so they can get out and be famous and get a rap record or get a deal, and it's crazy, right? That's for another day. But um, something that I just wanted to talk about is that racism is wired into uh, the law enforcement in many counties. Let me speak specifically with regard to Montgomery County. That's where I was wrongfully arrested, wrongfully charged. The police force, the white guys who came to assault me, they're racist. No, not Crowley, Sergeant, not Sergeant. Surgeon Charles Drengwitz, who fabricated his reports. And these are the methods they use, right? They falsify evidence, they plant evidence, they fabricate reports, right? They fabricate incident reports, they lie, they commit perjury. Surgeon Charles Drengwitz is a racist. At least what he did to me was racist. Uh, the police officer who tased me, who shot me, left me permanent scars, right? On my forehead. Um, Police officer Jeffrey Ray, is a racist because he used the slur on me, called me an animal. He's a racist. So the police department in Montgomery County, they're racist, right? They target black men, they prey on the black community to lock them up in jails, right? The state attorney's office is racist. The public defender's office is supposed to be protecting indigent black men. Um, they may be racist as well because, well, they don't do their jobs. They sabotage the cases of these indigent black men, right? Depending on them, relying on them, they sabotage their cases, sell them out to the state attorney, coerce them to take wrongful plea bargains, knowing that the state attorney's office tend to destroy evidence, fabricate evidence, commit perjury against these black people. So there's institutional racism. Some of the judges are racist. Like the judge, in my case, Judge James Bonifant, the way he's violated my constitutional rights, he's a racist. And if somebody with my impeccable record, right, I've talked about my background, I don't have to speak to that again, right? I hold a law degree from George Washington University Law School. As of the day I was arrested wrongfully in my own home where I wasn't committing a crime, no probable cause, no arrest warrant, um, I held a top secret TSSCI, right? The highest, one of the highest national security clearance you can have, right? Um, Working in the Department of the Navy for the federal government, right? I've been a John S. McCain Strategic Defense Fellow. The judge should know that the police are destroying evidence, they're falsifying evidence. In fact, the judge knew because my attorney that I had told the judge that the police distorted evidence. They distorted the charge statements. The judge should have dismissed the case a long time ago. He's been doing. He's been postponing. It's going on 4 years. He's been trying to coerce me, right, making the living conditions, unbearable for me, to coerce me to accept a wrongful plea bargain from the from the state attorney, which I've refused. So where there's a criminal justice system that's racist and targeting black people, black men, and incarcerating black men, right? Eventually, when so many black men are being carted off into jail and black women cannot be with them and form families with them and reproduce. I did international human rights law at Oxford University, and we identified a condition like that, and it's called genocide. So there's an insidious genocide going on in America, at least in Montgomery County. That's the only place I've seen. But before that, I had read cases, in law school about other places where there's police brutality, where the cops frame black men, and of course there are those dismal statistics, right? The infernal statistics that show the uh, disproportionate incarceration rates of black men in America. So there's an insidious genocide going on in America, using the carceral system, right, and the wrongful arrest and framing of black men. So next time African immigrants, right, talk about blacks being lazy. No, they shouldn't say that. They should consider a system that has created conditions to put them in a situation that they're in. When you've been arrested and they put a criminal record on you, they can't get jobs. It's virtually impossible for blacks to get jobs. Then they resort to crime. And blacks, they're not like Africans. Africans can always go back to Africa. They have their homes. In fact, Africans, most of the time, they send the money, a significant proportion of the money they make in America, they send it back home, right? Whether they're citizens or not, they send it back home. So they have somewhere they can go back to. Black Americans don't, right? When they get criminal records, so many of them are disenfranchised. They stop them in the South. They've stopped them from being able to vote. They bar them from being able to vote. They seize their passports. They can't get passports. They say, well, if it's a felony record, they say they can't leave the country. So a country where they're oppressed, where their rights are not respected, they can't even leave. You know. So think about sometimes when black people, new African immigrants, accuse black Americans of being criminals, they should consider the Africa that they left behind. They're criminals there. They many of us stay here because one, we have our families and we have Nigeria is one of those. I can't speak as to other African countries, but Nigeria is a country that has prosperity. You can become wealthy if you're well connected or you know your way. You can become wealthy because of the resources that we have. And a country that has over 200 million people, that's a huge consumer market if you're clever, right? So you can do a lot back home. But there's a huge problem with insecurity back home, right? People can get robbed back home. I've been robbed in Nigeria before. I mean, I was robbed before I came. You know, as a kid, I was robbed in Nigeria. So there, there are people who get into armed robbery back home. Robbery back home. There are people who get into armed. There are Black Americans who are robbers here as well. But of course, no. Not saying that they're painting all Black Americans with a broad brush and saying, well, they're all criminals. But I just want us to reflect more on the conditions that's pushing Black Americans in America into crime. And sometimes we should consider, are they being framed like me? There was no reason for me to ever have spent a day amongst criminals in prison. I've not been to prison, but jail, I've been detained, it's still the same thing. And I haven't had without a trial on trumped up charges. I was in my home. I haven't committed a crime against anybody. In fact, the police committed a crime. They robbed me, my property. They removed me naked from my home and, handcuffed me on a gurney in the middle of a hospital, naked, with white women looking. It was like, it just harks back to the lynching, the Jim Crow era when they were lynching black people. It was, they created that. They first gaslighted me when they came to my home, placed me under false imprisonment. And you see, it was a racist uh, force that came to get me. They used disinformation. They spread false information amongst my neighbors, saying there was a criminal holding a woman hostage in my apartment when that was not the case. The police just wanted to, they wanted to harm me, and they claim it was Jide Wari, this lunatic guy, the impersonator who perjured his statements. Jide Wari, the Howard University police professor, they said he was the one who lied, that they came with such a force to gaslight me and assault me and remove me naked from my home based on his false statements, his perjury. But they should have known, that his statements were false, were fabricated, right? Because I'd lived there for 2 years. I'd lived in that community, Silver Spring, that same area, for an aggregate of 6 years. So people knew me, right? They knew I didn't have a gun. I'd never possessed a gun. They knew I worked for the federal government, right? They knew I was a law-abiding person. I didn't have a criminal record. But they wanted to show me how the experience of white people intimidating blacks when they want to lynch a black man. That was what they wanted to show me. And then they they committed a crime in violation of 18 USC section 1801, right? Video voyeurism, by placing me naked and recording me naked in a hospital because they removed me naked from my apartment from without a stitch of clothing, with white women, staff just leaving me in the lobby. And they falsified information about me, wrote false information saying I was a homeless person, right? Spread false information. That's what the hospital reported, that I was a homeless psychotic trying to kill myself and trying to kill people. All fabrications. So I saw that the police officers are racist, they're corrupt. The state attorney is racist, is corrupt. The judge is racist, they're corrupt. So consider that many times blacks that you're seeing, maybe they've been framed and they end up getting into crime because they have no alternative. They have no other route. They're forced into it by a system of institutionalized racism and corruption. I'm going to stop this video here and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.